So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for the technical support. I would like to thank the organizers as well. I'm very glad to be here. So, the following 15-20 minutes, let me be your guide traveling back in time. Let's leave the pesky hours with their huge and amazing pedigrees behind and move back in time in the same region in Transdanubia, more exactly in the Little Hungarian Plain, and talk about 6th century children and their life experiences. I would like to warn you that I have more questions than answers. This is very preliminary. We are still working on it. And yeah, we are nowhere near the solution yet. Hopefully in the following years, it will eventually happen. So let's make use of this dubious privilege of presenting just before lunch. I'm hungry as well, so I will try to be as fast as possible. So just a bit of introduction. We are still in Transdanubia. Most of my examples will be from the Little Hungarian Plain. So this is a plainy area that extends to both sides of the Danube in northern Hungary and also southern Slovakia. This, in the Roman period, was part of the Roman Pannonian provinces. By the 6th century, it became the core territory of the Langobard kingdom, the Langobard polity. This is also an open area that connects southern Transdanubia, the lower Austria, like the Vienna Basin, and Moravia as well. This is one of the most densely settled areas in the 6th century, based on the archaeological information that we have. It's also open in a way that multiple important trade routes are crossing it. It has clear and very intensive cultural contacts to Western Europe and also to the Mediterranean, and it has a wide variety of sites. We have single burials, we have treasure finds, depots, cemeteries. What we don't have is settlements. So all of the information and all the data that I will be using to try to describe childhood experience will be based on burials. But in those cases, I will try to integrate genetic, isotopic, and archaeological evidence to come up with a somewhat comprehensive narrative to it. Our main focus will be the Little Hungarian Plain. In the histogenes, we had the rare opportunity of analyzing multiple sites from a single region that also has the same chronology. So when we are comparing these sites, we can remove some of the issues that like cultural difference, chronological difference, regional difference. We are comparing very much comparable sites. It's a very rare opportunity. We have two larger ones, Hegykő and Celeste. They are around 100 burials, and we have 3 smaller ones, and it will be also complemented with Solád, which is just south of the Lake Balaton. I made sure that it's not visible on the map. Apologies for that. So let's start with the bad. We are not in the same situation as the other period researchers are. You have heard about Kölked, which by itself has almost 1,400 graves. From the 6th century, let's say to 1st and 2nd third of the 6th century, we have altogether around 900 burials. Most of these come from fairly old excavation. It means 50s, mostly 60s, 70s. Preservation is not great, mostly due to the wide ranging of various burial disturbances. Most of the graves are disturbed. And of course, this bad preservation is really, really present, especially in case of the children burials. Physical anthropologists will correct me if I'm wrong, but I also think that the 6th century is like the bad-behaving foster child of physical anthropology. In a way, it has a troubled research history in Hungary. Most of these sites were analyzed by different people, and it also means somewhat of a problem to bringing the different types of analysis into a single platform. So I will be using these broad categories, infants 1 up to the age of 6, infants 2 up to the age of 15, and then everyone clumped together on the adult category. It has its limitations, but this is the best that I was able to do with the sites that I have in hand. So that's the bad out of the way. But because of that, archaeological research mostly grouped children as somewhat homogeneous groups. Of course, there are some pioneering work done. For example, Irena Barbiera in the beginning of 2000s did analyze multiple sites where she tried to differentiate between different age categories. But now, with more recent excavations and also the access of genetic sexing of non-adults, I think it gave us a great opportunity to revisit the question of children. So let's see where we are at. So first of all, there is this idea that children are generally missing or underrepresented in 6th century and also in Merovingian Europe. This is partially true, but what I found when started to collect data is that there is a very high variation between the ratio of children of different sites. Just from the Little Hungarian plain and Loránd, which is not that far from there, we see that the ratio of children, like infants 1 and infants 2 clumped together, is between 18% and 42%. So there is a high variation. Most notably, there are 2 sites with like this above 40 range, which is Hegykő and Loránd. Please keep in mind it will be important later on. But generally, the picture is true. Children are missing, or at least underrepresented compared to what you would expect of like pre-industrial communities. We don't have a clear explanation to that. We don't have any evidence of like they being buried separately on different places, etc. This is really just the data that we have. One other important thing is you can see that I don't have a category of like infants 1 or newborns or neonati, etc. They are really missing. Of all the sites that I went through, I think in the Little Hungarian plain there are like 4 individuals who would be there, so they are grouped together with the infants ones. Interestingly, although a recent discussion with Tamás Szenicei made me realize that it's not that interesting and somewhat expected, is that we have a lot more male children or male non-adults than female non-adults. The ratio is 1 to 1.5. So the first question, of course, and I will be talking about burials, that God save everyone, me talking about settlements anyway. So are children treated differently in terms of burials than adults or from adults? And it seems so, yes. In generally, yes. There are no like dedicated burial places for children, and they also do not form like separate clusters inside sites. But they are treated differently, at least burial-wise. So they generally have much shallower graves, which also means that the probability of losing a bit more child burials is more likely than losing adult burials. The difference is actually very, very significant. In the 6th century, we tend to have these sites with very, very deep graves. For example, the average depth, let's say in Szentendre, is around 2 meters, 80 centimeters, like 280 centimeters. That's the average depth of the graves. In case of non-adults, it's below 1 meter. So there is a significant gap between adult and male burials in terms of course, not just depths, but also lengths and widths, but that's more related to stature, probably. They have a simpler grave design. The graves that we found, like the House of the Dead, the post-hole structures, etc., they don't really show up in children burials. We do have coffins, though, so that they are still there. They contain less artifacts. You can see I try to showcase, I hope it's visible, 2 violin plots showing this comparison in Hegykő, that's the top plot, and Celeste, these are the 2 larger sites that I will be talking about today. And you can see that the average number of grave goods in adult and non-adult burials are statistically significantly different. And they also, it's important to note that certain artifact types, certain, let's say, prestigious artifact types, and these are mostly like gender-related ones, like weapons, certain types of jewelry, are generally missing in non-adult burials. But there are, of course, always exceptions. Oh, sorry, just a quick note. So Hegykő was the only site where it was described that there might be an area where children were buried, and that's marked with this orange circle, where you actually have a lot of children in the middle of the cemetery. I will come back to it. Now we know that the explanation is not really like grouping children together in one part of the cemetery, but it's related to another phenomenon. So let's just highlight one exception before we try to describe, or before I try to describe the general pattern. My example would be Freundorf, Lower Austria. This is a very small site with a very interesting structure. We have this like row of graves to the north and 1 adult male individual buried with its horse inside a late Roman stone structure. We do have a burial of a young woman between the ages of 1.5 years to 2 years old. And interestingly, she was actually buried in a funerary costume very similar to that of the adults. And they actually made a tiny brooch which actually has its typological parallel in the site as well. So that was custom made for her. It's much tinier. It's basically children-sized. This is one of the interesting exceptions of like the general patterns that I will try to describe later on. There is also this very interesting correlation between that she was buried together with an adult. It's not a multiple burial, but they are very, very close together and contemporaneous. They are not related. And this is a pattern that we will come back later on. We don't really have multiple burials. What we see is that children and their parents, even if they tend to be buried together, there is a lot more nuance to it. So my next question was, are female and male children, male non-adults, treated differently in this? And that's actually a very, very hard question to answer. First of all, as I mentioned, I don't have unlimited like burials. As soon as I try to break it down to smaller and smaller groups, I lose a lot of statistical power. If I group them like infants 1 males, infants 1 females, certain groups tend to be like, I don't know, 5 individuals, or at a site that group is completely missing. And of course, for me, the main interest would be community level differences. Are they there? But there are some patterns. So first of all, infants 1, it seems that males and females, like male and female non-adults, are treated very, very similarly. It has been already described earlier that female-specific artifact types do appear earlier in children burials, and it's usually described or interpreted in a way that female children, female non-adults, tend to have like this female role expressed earlier in the burial customs. What I found, or what we have found, is that indeed female-specific artifact types appear earlier, but they appear in both genetic male and genetic female non-adults. Might be that infants 1s, or like these very young children, do belong to the mother sphere or women's sphere, but this is really that appears. We do find jewelry usually found in adult female burials in the graves of young boys. Interestingly, the other way around, it doesn't work like that. We don't really see male-specific artifacts in like young female burials, but also we don't see them in young male burials. This somewhat changes in infants too, like age between, let's say, 7 and 15, where we mostly have these like gender-neutral grave goods, which include combs, knives, beads, food offerings, etc. What we have found is that male children tend to have buckles, and buckles are completely missing in case of female non-adult burials, which is interesting because buckles is actually like a gender-neutral artifact type among adults. You will find them basically everywhere. And also, you tend to find the first really like pieces of female jewelry in female infants 2s, and in male infants 2s they disappear. So even though they were there at the age of infants 1. And then when it really like starts the two groups separate is really like this age between 13 to 16, like really this problematic part of being infants 1 or juvenile category. First of all, this is where super high variation between sites start to appear, but this is also where females and males deviate from each other. First of all, as already mentioned in the Award period, this is also what we see in the 6th century, is that young adult females, let's say between the age of 13 to like 20, 25, have the most grave goods in general. The most richly furnished burials we find in these age categories, it might be their elevated social value just before or after marriage, but it's really, really, really there. Compared to that, in case of male burials, this is not true. Male gender-specific artifacts are generally missing. It's very rare that we actually find, let's say, a weapon, for example, in young adult males. They tend to be more common as we go on time. Usually like Adultus 1, Adultus 2, and Maturus 1 have like the most amounts of it. But this is really something where site-specific and site-specificity becomes a thing, and I will try to like highlight a few cases of that. I also try to compare if there is like a difference in terms of like number of grave goods, objects, artifact types, etc. between males and females, and there seems to be a slight correlation. It's not statistically significant. Maybe young or non-adult males tend to have a bit more objects in general than females. And this is where, like, besides we already using the genetic sex, which was provided, of course, by the genetic analysis, but really like combining that with pedigrees and families and how to like really introduce the roles of these children inside families that might bring us closer to like really understanding how to see these patterns. This is a site of Loránd. It was published in 2018 from a genetic point of view, and 2014 also the isotopic data was published. And this is a very specific case. This is the case where we actually do have weapons in young adult and like infants to male burials. Almost all of them do have weapons, interestingly. On the other hand, we don't see female gender-specific artifacts in female children graves. So it's quite the opposite that what we see in like other sites, interestingly. It also highlights one of the cases that this is a community that's formed around a fairly large pedigree, and that large pedigree forms basically the core of the cemetery. This is the pedigree, and these are the individuals belonging to this pedigree. But in terms of spatial organization, it doesn't really follow strictly the pedigree. For example, parents and offsprings are not necessarily buried next to each other or together. The most interesting case might be this adult male and non-adult male burial in the same circular ditch. That's actually an uncle-nephew relationship. They are buried together. The adult male actually does have a son at the site, and he's buried very close, just outside of the ditch. But interestingly, and this is what we see in sites, because Hegykő will be the same, and I will get to it very soon, is the same. It's organized around the large pedigree. They tend to have these relationships. The children and parents are not buried together, but children are generally buried with members of the extended pedigree, might reflect how like caring and fostering of these children was the role of the whole extended pedigree rather than just the family. The other cases where we have like these large pedigrees, and I do say large, but not in the mean of like the Rákóczi falva or the Medlin pedigrees. This is what we have large in the 6th century. Again, we have multiple children in it, and there is an interesting pattern. For example, this one, this individual buried in grave 32 is a young adult male, died between the age of 14 to 16. So really hard to describe whether it's actually like a child or an adult. But what we have seen is that if there are sites that are organized around these large pedigrees, they tend to have more children. Like Loránd and Hegykő are the two sites which have around 40% of subadult or non-adult individuals. And the sites that are not organized around these large pedigrees, but more like smaller fragmented ones, tend to have lot less children, around like 18 or even like below 20%. And what we also find, even though that these communities are not strictly patrilocal, we do have matrilineal lines, and we have heard about young mothers. I would like to highlight a thing that I found interesting is the presence of very young fathers. We do have fathers of the age between 13 to 16. Much younger than the youngest mothers that we have. Of course, we have very limited data. It might be like just pure luck, chance, etc. But we have multiple cases from multiple sites. For example, this individual buried here, like the grandfather of this like part of the pedigree, died at the age of 14 or 15. We do see very strong correlation between burial customs and families. For example, these 3 generations of males were all buried with like a bunch of arrowheads next to their legs. They liked arrowheads, they were hunters, who knows? But they are the only ones who were buried there, buried like that in Hegykő. Just very quickly, one example of a more fragmented or type of cemetery where it's not organized around these like large extended pedigrees. This is Celeste, has the same exact chronology as Hegykő, has similar amount of burials, a bit more, but has much smaller pedigrees. And what we have found is that spatial organization is focusing on the core families, and those more distantly related individuals are actually buried more distantly from them as well. And at the end, just before the conclusions, so how can we explain these differences? It seems that strontium analysis does actually help with that. what we see is that although mobility do have an important role in the life of both communities, the patterns are different. In Hegykő, we do see quite a few individuals, quite a few non-adult individuals at the age of infants too, who falls outside of this like possible local baseline. On the other hand, in Celeste, all children do like form this very narrow range, a much narrower range than the adult ones. And just very quickly, so the conclusions, for now, it will eventually change for sure, is I think the main takeaway is that we cannot treat children of the 6th century as one homogeneous group. They show as much heterogeneity in their burial customs as adults do, and it seems that site-level differences are very, very strong, and burial customs are actually influenced even by age and sex of these individuals as well. And of course, we have a lot of individual cases and exceptions from like these, let's say, general patterns that we have found. And over the course of histogenes, at the end, we will have around 20 sites dated to the 6th century from the Middle Danube region. So what we are hoping to do is to have like not just site-level comparisons, but also regional-level comparisons from Czechia to Slovenia to Serbia, etc. And this is probably the most important slide of the presentation. Of course, I was presenting today, but I was using the results and the contribution of a lot of individuals, and I'm very thankful for them, and I'm very glad to be part of the team. Thank you very much.